Well, good morning, everybody. I'd like to preface my remarks by saying that normally, the way I teach at Pepperdine, I would have an outline like this up on a screen, and very leisurely I'd cover the various points, and I have a laser pointer. I could go at it one at a time, and I'd feel free to digress, because I know that if I don't say everything I think is important to say, I meet with the students again the following week, so it's not a big deal. But in these very limited circumstances where I will see you just once on this subject, I want to be sure that I say all that I want to say and do so within a reasonable time, and that's why I've written out my remarks, which I should think would take about 20 minutes to go into, and then we'll open the floor for general discussion. I'm just going to try to establish a framework in about the first 20 minutes. And in this short time, I'll attempt to explain what I consider to be two fundamental propositions concerning our subject, resource economics and environmentalism. And the first proposition is that for practical purposes, there is no limit to the potential supply of natural resources. The same process by which man increases the supply of manufactured or processed goods enables him also repeatedly, indeed regularly, to increase the supply of economically usable, accessible natural resources. That will all be the first major proposition, the limitless potential of natural resources. Then second, by their very nature, production and economic activity improve the environment. That'll be my second major proposition. Well, let me start off with the first one. And to understand why, for all practical purposes, there is no limit to the potential supply of natural resources, we have to distinguish between two senses of the expression natural resources. First, there are natural resources as provided by nature. And second, there are natural resources originally provided by nature to which man's productive activity has given the character of goods and wealth. And I term these latter economically usable, accessible natural resources. So I've got natural resources in a original, more primary sense as given by nature, and then the natural resources given by nature to which man has, for which man has created the character of goods and wealth. Now this distinction is very rarely made. Typically it's assumed simply that natural resources come straight from nature, and that man's only connection with them is to use them up without being able to replace them. And this, of course, is what the conservationists and the environmentalists believe. And it's on the basis of this belief that they urge us repeatedly to, quote, reduce, reuse, recycle, unquote. And they're convinced that whatever depends on mining operations cannot be sustained. For sooner or later, the mines will give out. That's their idea. And so that's why we have to reduce, reuse, recycle. However, once we think in terms of the two senses of the expression natural resources, it becomes clear that the conventional view both radically overstates the contribution of nature to natural resources and also radically understates it, each, of course, in a different respect. The overstatement of nature's contribution consists of ignoring man's contribution to natural resources. For example, nature provides the chemical element iron, and it provides the chemical compound petroleum. However, it does not provide iron mines or oil wells, or even iron or petroleum in the form of goods. Before there can be such things as iron mines or oil wells, an enormous human contribution is required. First, man must discover uses for the iron or petroleum that nature has provided. Only after such time is it possible for iron or petroleum to acquire the status of goods or wealth. And for thousands of generations, for the thousands of generations of human beings who lived and died before the end of the Stone Age, and even for many generations thereafter, iron was not a good. It was not a good because, not knowing its uses, people were not in a position to derive any actual good from it. The same is true of petroleum. It did not become a good until sometime around the middle of the 19th century, when it was discovered that petroleum could be used to make kerosene, which in turn could serve as fuel in lanterns. Only then were people in a position to derive any good from petroleum, and only then did petroleum become a good. Well, every natural resource that is a good, unless its benefit comes to us automatically, like that of atmospheric air or sunlight, without our having to perform labor or take conscious action of any kind in order to obtain its benefit, every good apart from those rests on a human contribution no less than on nature's contribution. What nature provides is mere things. And we have to recognize with Carl Menger, quote, that if a thing is to become a good, or in other words, if it is to acquire good's character, all of the following four prerequisites must be simultaneously present. And now I'm quoting Menger. One, a human need. I think Professor Salerno gave you this same quotation, but I guess you haven't memorized it, so I'll repeat it. Such properties as render the thing capable of being brought into a causal connection with the satisfaction of this need. 3, human knowledge of this causal connection. 4, command of the thing sufficient to direct it to the satisfaction of the need. So all four of those things have to be present at the same time for a thing to be a good. Now, the quotation from Menger implies that besides the discovery of uses for it, there's a second requirement of a thing becoming a good that rests on man's contribution, and that is his fourth prerequisite, namely command over the thing sufficient to direct it to the satisfaction of the need. And what this refers to in our context is the fact that in order for any particular deposit, let's say of iron or petroleum or anything else, to qualify as a good or as wealth, not only must it specifically be discovered, but also man must establish a power of physical command over that specific deposit, sufficient for him to get at the deposit, extract it, and then put its contents into a form and bring it to the locations where he was actually able to put it to its intended uses. However useful we know it to be, the mere chemical element iron is not a good, at least not yet, insofar as it is located on Mars, or is found in the Earth's core, or under the middle of the ocean, or in any other presently inaccessible place. In fact, it would not be a good any time soon, even after we establish the physical ability to send a rocket ship to Mars and have it return with some Martian iron ore. For an implication of Menger's view is that we must have command over the thing sufficient to enable us to use it gainfully. Sending perhaps a $100 billion rocket ship to fetch a few dollars worth of iron ore would not be a gainful process. Thus, iron ore on Mars would still not be a good because it could not actually do us any good in those conditions. Well, exactly this point applies at the present time to such a thing as shale oil. Shale deposits are not yet goods or wealth, even though we know that they contain oil and know what can be done with oil, and also have the technology and the equipment required to extract oil from shale. The problem is the cost. However, if and when sufficiently more efficient methods of production were developed to make possible the gainful extraction of oil from shale, such deposits would thereupon achieve the status of economic goods and wealth. They would then, in fact, be able to do us good. And these points have a major application looking back at comparatively recent economic history, the economic history of the last 2 centuries. The supply of economically usable, accessible iron ore has been dramatically increased over the last 2 centuries or more as man has increased his ability to dig deeper in more locations, and to do so with less and less human labor and at lower and lower real cost. It has increased as man has improved his knowledge of nature and learned to break down different compounds more economically, such as becoming able to separate iron from sulfide compounds as well as oxide compounds, and do so more economically. Similarly, the supply of economically usable, accessible petroleum has steadily increased as man has developed the knowledge and produced the capital equipment that enable him to drill efficiently at greater and greater depths in more and more locations and to work deposits previously impossible or too costly to work. One of the major accomplishments of Rockefeller and Standard Oil was to develop the process of petroleum cracking. This enabled oil deposits containing a high sulfur content to become workable and correspondingly increased the supply of economically usable, accessible petroleum. Well, so much for the overstatement of nature's contribution and the corresponding understatement of man's contribution. Now let me turn to the aspect or to the respect in which nature's contribution to natural resources is itself understated. Nature, of course, does contribute the material stuff that is in all the mines and wells. It contributes all the chemical compounds and elements. However, its contribution of chemical elements and compounds is hardly limited to the quantities that reside in what man has thus far been able to make into goods in the form of mines and wells. Nature's actual contribution of natural resources is immensely greater than this. In fact, it comprises the totality of matter and energy in every form, known or as yet unknown, that exists in the earth, and indeed, to be strictly accurate, in the entire universe. And as I said on a previous occasion, even if we limit our horizon exclusively to the planet Earth, which certainly need not be our ultimate limit, the magnitude of natural resources supplied by nature is mind-bogglingly huge. It is nothing less than the entire mass of the Earth and all of the energy that goes with it, from thunderstorms in the atmosphere, a single one of which discharges more energy than all of mankind produces in an entire year, to the tremendous heat found at the Earth's core in millions of cubic miles of molten iron and nickel. And, indeed, the natural resources provided by nature in the Earth alone extend from the upper limits of the Earth's atmosphere 4,000 miles straight down to its center. This enormity consists of solidly packed chemical elements. Think about it. There is not 1 cubic centimeter of the Earth anywhere, either on its surface or anywhere below its surface, that is not some chemical element or other, or some combination of chemical elements. This is nature's contribution to the natural resources contained in this planet. It indicates the incredibly enormous extent of what is out there awaiting transformation by man into natural resources possessing goods character. Well, the key to understanding the subject of natural resources is to realize that at any given time, the supply of economically usable, accessible natural resources is never more than a tiny fraction of the supply of natural resources supplied by nature, and that fraction is capable of progressive enlargement for an indefinitely long period of time, while all the while still remaining infinitesimally small in comparison with what is out there in nature. The fraction is enlarged on the same basis as man's ability to produce goods in general is enlarged, namely scientific and technological progress and saving and capital accumulation. These provide growing knowledge of and physical power over nature, and thereby enable man to convert a larger and larger portion of nature into economically usable, accessible natural resources. And to judge how early we still are in this process, it should be realized that despite all of the progress of the last 2 centuries or more, all of our mining efforts are still confined almost entirely within the 30% or so of the Earth's surface that is land, and in depth are still measured in feet rather than in miles. The technology and the capital equipment that will break through these barriers are already on the horizon, and provided that their development is not thwarted by environmentalism or by government intervention otherwise inspired, clearly have the potential to enlarge the supply of economically usable, accessible natural resources in the centuries to come, far beyond anything we have been able to achieve up to now. Well, I turn now to the second proposition, namely that by their very nature, production and economic activity improve the environment, man's environment. This proposition follows from the fact that the physical world consists of nothing but solidly packed chemical elements, and that from the perspective of physics and chemistry, all of production and economic activity consist merely of changing the combinations and locations of the chemical elements. The production of automobiles or refrigerators, for example, entails the movement of some part of the world's supply of the element iron from locations such as the Mesabi Range in Minnesota to places all across the country and the world. In the process, the iron is broken out of combination with certain other chemical elements, such as oxygen or sulfur, and put into combination with different chemical elements, such as chrome or nickel. The overall quantity of each of the elements in the world remains exactly the same as before. The only difference is in the relationship of the chemical elements to human life and well-being, which is obviously vastly improved by man's productive activity. Iron buried in the hillsides of Minnesota is useless, but changed by human productive activity to take the form of automobiles, refrigerators, bridges, and skyscrapers, and countless other products, it is of immense utility. Similarly, man's productive activity moves some part of the world's uranium and the elements constituting the world's coal, oil, and natural gas from the locations in which nature has placed them, and with some changes in composition, relocates them in power plants and fuel tanks, thereby enabling them to release energy to heat and light homes, power industrial machinery, automobiles, airplanes, ships, and railroad trains, and in countless other ways serve human life. These examples capture the essential nature of productive activity. Its fundamental purpose and regular consequence is nothing other than improving the relationship of the nature-given chemical elements to human life and well-being. When one stops to consider that man's physical environment consists of nothing but chemical elements and their actions, and that productive activity serves by its nature to improve the relationship of those elements to human life and well-being, it follows that productive activity by its nature serves to improve man's environment. And that fact, indeed, is present in the common recognition that the central concern of economic activity is precisely with the improvement in the external material conditions of human life, which again is nothing other than man's environment, his external material conditions. That's his environment. Well, economic and productive activity improve man's environment in every respect. As I've written, to live, man needs to be able to move his person and his goods from place to place. If an untamed forest stands in his way, such movement is difficult or impossible. It represents an improvement in his environment. Therefore, when man moves the chemical elements that constitute some of the trees of the forest somewhere else, and lays down the chemical elements brought from somewhere else to constitute a road, it is an improvement in his environment when man builds bridges, digs canals, opens mines, clears land, constructs factories and houses, or does anything else that represents an improvement in the external material conditions of his life. All of these things represent an improvement in man's material surroundings, his environment. all of them represent the rearrangement of nature's elements in a way that makes them stand in a more useful relationship to human life and well-being. Now, the environmentalists, of course, do not see things this way. In their view, production and economic activity represents systematic harm to the environment. And that is because, to them, the environment is not the surroundings of man deriving its value from its relationship to man, but nature in and of itself, deriving its value from itself, i.e. allegedly possessing intrinsic value. And to see this point clearly, consider the following example. 25 years ago, the land under the house that my wife and I now live in Southern California, just 25 years ago, that land was empty desert. Had I wanted to sleep in the same location that my bedroom now stands on, I would have had to bring a sleeping bag, take precautions against rattlesnakes, scorpions, coyotes, and hope I could find a place for my sleeping bag such that I wouldn't have rocks pressing into my body. If it rained, I would get wet. If it was cold out, I would be cold. If it was hot, I would be hot. Going to the bathroom would be a chore. Washing up would be difficult or impossible. How incomparably better is the environment provided by my house and my bedroom? I sleep on a bed with an inner spring mattress. I don't have to worry about snakes, scorpions, or coyotes. I'm protected from the rain, the cold, and the heat by a well-constructed house with central heating and air conditioning. I have running water, hot and cold, a flush toilet, a sink, a shower, and a bathtub. And I have electricity and most of the conveniences it makes possible, such as a television set, VCR, and CD player. It's obvious to me that the existence of my house constitutes an enormous improvement in my environment compared with living at that same location on the bare ground, and that the same is true of the existence of virtually all houses in relation to the environment of their occupants. It's further obvious to me that the process of improving the environment in this way starts with developers and contractors who bring in bulldozers and other heavy construction equipment to clear the tops of hills and level and compact the land, build streets and utility connections, and construct houses. The environmentalists, of course, describe the exact same process of development and construction as harming the environment. Why? Because in their view, hillsides and empty land, as they exist in the state of nature, together with its wildlife, have intrinsic value. And those alleged intrinsic values are harmed by development and construction. In other words, the harm the environmentalists complain about in such cases is harm only from a non-human, indeed anti-human perspective. And I believe that the only appropriate and healthy answer to the environmentalists in such cases is to hell with their alleged intrinsic values. Let's call in the bulldozers. Well, I thank you all very much, and now I hope we can open the floor to all kinds of cross-discussion and questions, and I'll try to minimize my role in this. So, thank you. Yes, sir.
What's your opinion about the growth of population? Because, for example, for instance, Mises in Human Action supports that it's good Malthusian politics.
Malthusianism, yeah.
Yes. What is your opinion about the population increase, for example?
Is there anyone in the audience who would like to address this question? The question is, I believe, what are the consequences of population increase as they would relate?
If probably was Mises or not at this point.
And your interpretation of Mises is what on this subject? How are you interpreting his position?
Mises, I understand that Mises in Action of the Academy support the increase of population is not good. It must be a limit, must be limited.
Well, I don't have that impression. It's possible you might find passages of Human Action that seem to imply that, but I didn't particularly come away with that idea from reading Human Action. In fact, I'll attempt to answer the question. is population growth a threat or not? And I would say it depends very vitally on the context in which it occurs. If you have population growth taking place in a society of hunters or an agricultural society, then they run up sooner or later against the limit of how much the land can support. Like with the North American Indians, the maximum population of Indians living as they lived, that the whole North American continent north of the Rio Grande River was able to support was, I believe, roughly 1 million Indians. Because the Indians lived by hunting, each Indian might have needed several square miles of territory to assure the availability of enough game. And when they got to be more than 1 million, they were overpopulated. Now, with agriculture, the same territory can support vastly more people, but then there are limits there. If you have more and more people and they're farming the same way, they have to keep subdividing the plots and creeping up the hillsides and down into the swamps. And so you reach a limit where additional population would have negative effects. But I believe that conditions are radically changed in the context of a division of labor society, because there, the larger the population, the greater the extent to which the division of labor can be carried. Now, an example that I use in terms of a medical school, let's say. Suppose in order to keep one physician tolerably well occupied, enough broken arms going on and appendectomies and whatever, let's make the assumption that you need 1,000 people per physician to give him enough work to do. And let's assume that an efficient-sized medical school could turn out 100 graduates a year. There's enough interaction between the students and the faculty can lecture to enough students. So let's say 100 students a year is a good-sized graduating class. And imagine that each doctor, on an average, will be in practice 40 years after graduation. Ultimately, we'd have 4,000 physicians. Well, what would be the underlying population needed to support this medical school? 4 million people. Well, now consider if you had just 4,000 physicians in practice, out of 4,000 physicians, how many could perhaps be brain surgeons or heart specialists? Let's say 4, 1 in 1,000 physicians. Well, now imagine if instead of a population of 4 million, the participating population in the division of labor were 400 million. Now we could have 100 such medical schools. We could have 400 brain surgeons, heart surgeons, whatever. That's enough. They could have a small journal. They could have a convention in Hawaii or whatever. And there'd be interaction. And what would be the likelihood if you have 400 people working in a specialized field of this kind? What's the likelihood of their achieving greater knowledge and success, which can quickly be communicated to all the others? It's greatly increased. Now, if you have 4 billion people, you multiply it again by a factor of 10. And I think that the increase in the size of population participating in the division of labor internationally, this has been a tremendously positive factor. If you think of the effects of the increase in the absolute number of people pursuing all the different branches of science and engineering and invention, the larger the absolute scale on which these activities can be carried, the greater is the scientific and technological progress. And just imagine, suppose if we had double the population, instead of 1 Thomas Edison, there were 2. Well, I think that can easily overcome the effects of diminishing returns, having to creep higher up the hillsides and so on. So in the context of a division of labor capitalist society, I would say such population growth as it experiences has a positive effect by accelerating technological and scientific progress. It more than easily overcomes the effects of diminishing returns, because we're introducing new methods of production, new types of equipment. So that isn't a problem in a division of labor society. And where you have population as being a problem, that's outside the division of labor. Yes, sir, Mr. England.
On this question, a great book to read would be Hayek's The Fatal Conceit, the Errors of Socialism. And he speaks exactly to what you spoke. And division of labor, everything, and he mentioned that if you have an ethic or aesthetics where you talk with the environmentalists, if they had their way, his point was that you would condemn billions to death and the rest to poverty. Mm-hmm. So, the alternative, that what they're talking about is very much a use of anti-human, and this book really addresses that beautifully.
Yeah, I recently read The Fatal Conceit. I think he may have some discussion about the aesthetic of environmentalism. I don't recall a discussion about the carrying the division of labor further, however. It is in there. It's a brief passage, but it is in there. And it talks about how that with this, that in his opinion, more densely populating the earth is a positive thing. Right, okay, I recall that. Yeah. Yeah, now, a problem with environmentalism, suppose you had people who insisted that an essential requirement of their happiness is that they not be able to see another human being as far as they could see. That you'd have to have empty space extending to the horizon. Now, if people held that as an essential, absolute requirement of their happiness, that would be inconsistent with any significant human population. We'd end up with a smaller population than the American Indians in North America. And that, in fact, would be a profoundly anti-human approach to things. Yes, sir, this gentleman.
I always thought population control measures is self-defeating, because if you allow for economic development, population increases, the rate tends to fall off, as we've seen in industrialized societies versus, say, the African economies.
Yes, it's certainly true that as a country becomes more prosperous, the rate of growth of population does tend to decline. And in many European countries, the birth rate is in fact somewhat below the level required to maintain the population. And it is not far above it even in the United States. It might possibly even be a little less. And what keeps population growth going in many of the advanced countries is only immigration from the poorer countries. And it's been argued that the reason for this kind of outcome is that a major motive for people having, first, people have very large numbers of children in poor, backward countries, in large part because they don't have measures of birth control, let alone abortion. And also, they expect routinely that a large proportion of whatever children they have will die. And they may consider themselves lucky if 2 or 3 out of 10 children survive to adulthood. That was certainly that way earlier in Western history. But then as they see that it's likely for whatever children you have will survive, they don't feel the need to have as many, and so that reduces the birth rate.
In particular, there was also that they had many children because we didn't have the division of labor so much in agriculture in particular. They did help to do work around the home.
Well, that would be an explanation perhaps in the United States, but if you look at countries like India and China, having more children would mean if they all survived, you wouldn't have any land to bequeath to them. You'd have to keep subdividing it.
Also, it seems like you have to give up a career or certain types of labor in order to have it. So it seems like the division of labor might actually end up working against population increase. Like to be a successful neurologist, you probably wouldn't want to have that.
Yeah, and the division of labor raises the standard of living dramatically, and when people see that their children will survive as a result of being able to have much better medicines and treatment and nutrition and so on, then the birth rate falls. Yes, sir.
Sir,
and your name, sir?
My name is Alex Silver.
Yeah.
It's kind of a general question, but what do you think of national? I know they're set aside by the government, but how do you feel about national parks, like areas that are set aside for?
National parks, I mean areas of great natural scenic beauty?
Yeah. It's there for beauty, but...
Yeah, I'm in favor of their being privately owned, because I think if they were privately owned, the owners would want to take advantage of their natural beauty, and there'd be many people wanting to go and visit such places. And with private ownership, it would be much more accessible, and there would be far more conveniences and amenities. Now, if you want to go to a place like Yosemite National Park or Glacier National Park, you may find that the government has one rather small hotel, which you may have to make a reservation at a year or more in advance. And then they may have little cabins or whatever that are open to the elements, or you have to sleep in an RV or something. And so it's not easy to come and enjoy the beautiful area. But if they were privately owned, I think you'd have a range of beautiful hotels in different price ranges, and far more people could actually enjoy these things. So I think the benefit would be vastly greater if there were private ownership. Yes, sir.
Do you think that if this was privately owned, that people would set it aside for just enjoyment of it as nature, or that they would not fall prey to the lumber company wanting to come in and, well, we'll pay you a lot of money so that we can use the land? Okay,
here's a lumber company. They want to come in and chop trees down. Well, you see, it's a question which use is willing and able to outbid which other use. And lumber is available from many, many different locations. And you don't have to get the lumber in a way that would destroy the scenic beauty. You see, I think in a sense, your question may be comparable if I translate it into the area where I live. In the area where we live now, not very long ago, there used to be orange trees growing. And you could ask the question, well, why do the owners of the land devote it now to residential housing and shopping malls and so forth, rather than just turning it back to growing oranges? Why do you think it's worked out that way? Because the people willing to pay prices for houses and commercial sites can easily bid far more than the users for orange groves. Well, if there's a site of tremendous natural beauty that people are eager to get to and are willing to pay a substantial premium in a hotel rate, like suppose to construct a certain type of hotel facility anywhere, you might, to cover a normal rate of profit, let's imagine you'd have to charge $100 a day. But if that same hotel were located in an astoundingly beautiful area that people were desperately eager to see, the same costs of construction and maintenance would enable you to charge an extra $50 or $100 per day per person per room. Well, that would make that use incredibly more profitable and more advantageous. The higher value of the land would derive from its use as a scenic area. And any other economic activity would have to be carried on in a way that did not disturb that primary function. So if it was possible, for example, to drill for oil starting a mile away and no one in the immediate area would see what was going on, there was just some tunnel underneath and they were extracting oil or coal or whatever, well, then you could have both uses simultaneously. But I don't think that the private owners of land would be so stupid as to use something in contradiction to its natural advantages. Let me try to find someone. Yes, sir, right here.
Referring to environmentalism, how would you resolve the problem of pollution? Like, to me, it'd be obvious that if somebody polluted, and you could tell that how much they polluted on your property, but if somebody puts out pollution and it pollutes 1,000 people's properties, how would you be able to make reparation for the damages that they've caused you?
Okay, that's a very good question. What about pollution? And I have certain other topics here. This comes under their heading. Now, I think it's routinely assumed that anytime anything of any sort happens to disturb your use and enjoyment of something, that you have an automatic claim to compensation. And I don't think that that is always true. I think that in order to establish a legitimate claim to compensation, you'd have to be able to establish that there are specific entities causing you harm. Now, there are some cases where it may be a little more plausible to come to that conclusion, others less so. Let me give you a hypothetical case first. Think of the effects of the settlement of the American Midwest. We had millions of people moving across the Appalachian Mountains, and they cleared tremendous tracts of forest. And because they were cutting down tremendous amounts of trees, you had less water retained in those areas, and that probably added to the level of flooding down in New Orleans through the various tributaries flowing into the Mississippi River. Now, do you think it would have been reasonable imagine there had been an environmental movement, say, early in the 19th century. They would have been arguing, well, this development of the Midwest, this is just terrible. It's going to cause flooding down in New Orleans. Should they be allowed to proceed? Now, I would say they certainly should have been allowed to proceed, and I'm very glad we didn't have an environmental movement at that time. Even if the resulting outcome is that there's more flooding down in New Orleans. And I don't think it would have been reasonable to say to any individual farmer, to Daniel Boone or whoever, or any of his associates, you can't clear your land because you're doing something that's going to raise the water level at New Orleans. I would say that's nonsense. You should not be blocking the movement of millions of people in order to avoid some byproduct of their combined activity. There are other ways to respond to it. The people down at New Orleans should build higher dikes. Or maybe some of the land will no longer be usable. They should respond to it. Now, I would say as a general principle that each individual should be free to proceed and only be stopped when it can be shown that he is doing some identifiable harm to someone else. I remember when I went to NYU, they were constructing a new building for NYU. And it was held up for several years because the owner of an adjacent building was concerned that her foundation was being undermined by the excavation for the foundation for the new NYU building. Well, that would, in principle, is a legitimate concern, a legitimate complaint. But that's not what the environmentalists have in mind. Their case, they concentrate on cases where an individual is not doing any perceptible, identifiable harm, but if you add up vast numbers of individuals, there is a negative byproduct of the huge number, like the millions of farmers. And that case applies to global warming on an even bigger scale. Here we are, we're going about our daily lives, we burn gasoline in our cars, we heat our houses, one thing and another, and the combined collective aggregate byproduct of hundreds of millions or billions of people behaving this way is maybe, and I stress maybe, that the mean temperature of the world will go up a little bit. Well, okay, so it's going up, but I would say no individual human being is responsible or should be stopped, and the proper way to treat such outcomes is as the equivalent of an act of nature. See, nature can raise the flood level at New Orleans. Nature could raise the mean temperature of the world. Why do we have to control the actions of millions and billions of people in each minor respect of their lives in order to avoid global warming? Let's let the global warming occur and we'll deal with it. We'll respond in the same way that we respond to other things coming from nature. Now, if we have global warming, well, some areas of the world might be less usable than they are now. Others will be more usable. Central Canada will open up, southern Greenland. What we need to cope with this problem is economic freedom, particularly much greater freedom of immigration and emigration. You see, if individuals are individually free to do what's best for their own self-interest, well then people will observe the growing conditions for some crops are now poorer in their present locations, others are better elsewhere. It'll be better to live in different locations, locate your businesses elsewhere, and they will solve the aggregate problem bit by bit. Now, let me just give you a last analogy. Suppose we had the environmentalist mentality before the age of the automobile. And then and imagine they could project what the effects of the automobile would be. And they would say, well, this will mean that millions of people will relocate from cities out to suburbs. And we'll need tens of thousands of fueling stations. And millions of the whole horse breeding industry will be decimated. What will happen to the oat growers? One thing and another. And this could appear as an overwhelming problem. How are we going to cope? How is the world going to deal with this avalanche of the automobile that's coming? Well, you see, if you're a bureaucrat in Washington and you think you have to solve it, you can't deal with it. It seems like an incredible, overwhelming problem. But the way it got solved is millions and tens of millions of individual people solved their personal problems. Someone decided, well, now we have a car, wouldn't it be nice to live in a suburb? And piece by piece, people made these decisions. Others realized, well, here there are people moving to suburbs. Wouldn't this be a good place to open a new store? Don't we need filling stations? See, what's driving environmentalism is the mentality of collectivism. There are problems, and it's thought the government must address the problems. And the government must control the entire human race. You see, it's a change in a couple of superficial features of socialism. The socialists argued you have to organize mankind collectively in order to achieve greater progress and prosperity. The environmentalists say we have to organize the human race collectively and control all their actions in order to avoid some kind of catastrophe. And the reality is we should not be attempting to control people. Let them pursue their own individual interests. And in doing that, they'll be able to cope with the negative byproducts of productive activity as well as they do with the main problems coming from nature. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, though, how can you draw that arbitrary line in the sand, though, and say that, one thing like the flooding in New Orleans is not enough to intervene, but obviously, like, if you set up a factory next to someone's house and their kids were getting asthma and stuff, you'd say, well, of course, they should be able to do that.
Yeah, but now you see, here's the distinction, you see. In the example you just gave, someone sets up a factory next to your house or your orchard or whatever. You have an individual, a clearly identifiable cause of a harm, of a perceptible harm. So whenever you could show that some party is causing some perceptible harm, you have a legitimate basis of action.
Right, but clearly identifiable, isn't that sort of like an arbitrary subjective notion?
No.
To me, like to environmentalists, it's clear that if you tear down all the forests in the Midwest, you're going to flood New Orleans, and that's clearly identifiable.
Well, now you see, if you tear down enough forest, you'll flood New Orleans. But if I'm clearing my 160 acres, I'm not flooding New Orleans. See, I would say the basic principle is that individuals should be held accountable only for their own individual actions, not for the actions of the wider group of which they are members. So an individual person is responsible for what he does, and an individual company is responsible for what it does, but an individual human being is not responsible for the activities of tens of millions of people similarly circumstanced. And in that case, where the individual is not responsible, we should regard the outcome of the vast number as the equivalent of an act of nature. And then ask, how would we deal with it regarding it as an act of nature? Well, we take steps to cope with it. So down in New Orleans, they have to build the dikes higher, or maybe there's some land they won't use there. But you see, if you insist on everyone being tightly controlled to avoid any negative outcome, you're jerking the dog around to avoid a little movement of its tail. Yes, sir.
Well, I have a question then, because you said it's the collectivity of people in the north that would cause the flooding in Louisiana.
Yeah.
But what if you could set up an equation and say, well, there's this many people up in the north, and they're clearing this much land, and that would mean that it's 0.05% your fault for the flooding in the south, and you should pay reparations of that amount. How would you respond to that claim?
No, you see, you're simply saying, here's the negative outcome that results from 1 million people collectively, or however many million people. And I would say that your action alone causes no perceptible harm, that we should not attribute to you responsibility that you as an individual don't have. Yes?
Taking the example of the factory, what if instead of one person setting up that factory, there was two people setting up that factory, and both of equal importance to that factory? Would you be able to blame both people equally?
Well, they're acting as one unit, an enterprise, an entity that acts as a unit, that has responsibility. So imagine we had a company with 1 million stockholders, but it's the company that is acting on behalf of all of them, and it is clearly the responsible agent. But now if you have thousands and tens of thousands of companies across the world, the combined result of which may be global warming, I would say they are not responsible. Let's deal with the problem as the equivalent of an act of nature. There's someone I didn't get yet. Yes?
Well, I guess the difference is the difference between the individual methodologies and a holistic approach. It's just
exactly.
Mises' differentiation between an approach where you can everybody's responsible for their acts and they can have the results, the good results from the acts, and they have to pay for the bad results of the acts. But you cannot make somebody pay for something that a class that it's over an individual or a juridical individual. I think it's so simple.
Exactly. I think that is the basic difference. It's individualism versus collectivism. And if you go down the road of classes, well then you can hold any individual responsible for acts that his nation may have committed at any time, or members of his race, or religion, or whatever. And you're on the road, well, you don't have to go any further than environmentalism. It's enough to try to regulate every aspect of people's lives, tell them they have to drive cars, if they're going to be allowed to drive cars at all. I mean, you have environmentalists, alleged scientist panels claiming that we should have a 90% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions to prevent global warming, as though the solution for excessive heat is to destroy our ability to have air conditioners and refrigerators. That's how they'll deal with excessive heat. Yes?
You have to admit, though, with current technological restrictions, natural resources are, in a way, allocated collectively. I mean, we share air, and, everything in nature sort of has an effect on everybody else in a way.
Well,
we can't all live in a bubble. So if it's collectively allocated, shouldn't we deal with it in a collective way?
But there is no collective allocation. We all breathe air, and we interact. And it's true that each person does things that has effects on other people, and it's precisely because of that you don't want to make that the standard. Because if you say you should not be able to do anything that has any effect of any kind on other people that they're not happy with, well, then you'd be enslaved. You would have to operate within the strictest limits. What we want is a major sphere of freedom for the individual. We want the individual to be able to do anything that he finds it to his personal advantage to do, except resort to the initiation of physical force. Acts like murder, robbery, rape, fraud. We want the individual to be free to do anything else that he finds to his personal advantage.
Now, that's just the different levels of physical force. Like, obviously, I can directly murder you, and we can identify that. But what if I kill you slowly over time by what I'm doing to the air or whatever?
Well, you are not personally killing me by whatever you're doing to the air. Suppose you smoke 6 packs of cigarettes a day. You'll drive your car 20 hours a day, run your air conditioner for the same time. You do everything in your power that the environmentalists don't like. You're not going to have any effect on me.
Right.
Now, if you backed your car and you attached a hose from your exhaust pipe and ran it into my living room, then I would have some action against you.
But I mean, obviously, if millions of us do the same thing, then that does have an effect on you.
Well, there is some effect, but then there is a response. You see, let's say there are conditions going on that you don't like. Well, then you don't have to stand there like a zombie. You can respond. Now, it may be, there are certain cases, and local air pollution is perhaps a good one. And I come from the Los Angeles area, and there's a particular problem there. Now, it might be that the simplest, most effective method of limiting the problem of smog there was to install catalytic converters on cars. But even so, as a matter of principle, I would object to the government mandating it. And I'm in favor, this addresses the wider problem of externalities and how to deal with them. I think, the usual objection is, well, if you as one individual were to install a catalytic converter on your car, you would have as little positive effect on the overall situation as you also have negative effect. And in order to have any positive effect, you would need some very substantial number of people to do the same thing. Well, I think such a thing could be achieved voluntarily. And imagine the following kind of election. Instead of just going into a ballot box and marking yes or no on a proposition or whatever, suppose we had a different type of election where what you do is, part of the process is you leave your credit card number. And let's say there's a proposition which says if some minimum number of people agree to this proposition and also pledge a certain minimum amount of money, and then that minimum number is reached, their pledges will be activated. So imagine we had a proposition that said if 1 million people, each of whom has agreed to pay $100, assuming there are 1 million people agreeing to the same thing, well then the $100 of each of the million will be called upon. They'll have left their credit card number, they've agreed to it. If that minimum threshold is not reached, well then there aren't enough people willing to do it. You could have different methods used. We don't know necessarily that the catalytic converter is the best way. Maybe there are people who could come up with something, inject some other chemical into the air to neutralize the smog. So that would be a way of dealing with such issues. Yes?
What would you say about Canada, where, for instance, I'm from Detroit, and a lot of our pollution, just because of the way the wind is and the current, just goes right over there, and we don't have to deal with it. But it is kind of directly related to Detroit. Like, they can pinpoint where the pollution comes from. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's say they can pinpoint that it comes from Detroit. But now, unless they could also pinpoint, the way I say things, is that some specific, significant amount, let's say, is coming from Detroit Edison. I assume there's such a company. And the specific pollution from Detroit Edison is causing some negative effect. Then I would think that they don't have a basis. The mere fact that a vast number of people produces some negative effect, just think of the fact, if you live in a large city, what is the effect on the speed with which traffic moves? It's going to be very slow and disturbing. Well, should there be sanctions imposed on the fact that there are a lot of people, and if those nasty people weren't all there, your life would be simpler and you'd be able to get from place to place faster. You see, there are certain negatives that may occur when you have large numbers of people doing things. Think also of the fact, what is the effect on apartment rents or house rents by virtue of the fact that you have a large number of people wanting to live in a particular city? Could you say, well, I don't like this. I want these people not to be allowed to move into my town. See, you have to accept certain negatives. If the negatives are not inflicted upon you by the initiation of physical force on the part of identifiable entities, then there are certain negatives you have to live with. But there is an attitude that no one, or at least not the environmentalists, should ever have to accept any negative of any kind. That they have the right to manipulate the lives of the rest of the world to suit their convenience. Yes?
Could you say that last statement for the same thing for a paper plant that makes whatever, if they dump stuff, it's convenient for them to dump their waste products into a stream or whatever. So it's convenient for them to do that. So I mean, it would be us saying, well, it's not convenient for us to have that put into our water because we have to clean it out.
Well, there would be an issue. I'm sorry.
Will it be their convenience versus our convenience?
Pardon me?
It would be their convenience versus our convenience. I mean, it's.
Well, no. Now I think you're addressing something a little bit different. Let's say here you are, and you've been drawing water from a certain stream, and you've established some right of use, and now you could identify some specific parties that are interfering with that. Well, then you perhaps might have a legitimate basis of action. But let's say that there are certain possible sources of water that will not be usable. I grew up in New York City, and I remember as a child, sometimes I would walk in Riverside Drive along the banks of the Hudson River, and it was obviously not a very suitable place to go swimming. You could see all kinds of things drifting down the river. And all kinds of companies were discharging things, and sewage was running in, and so on. But I have to tell you, shocking as it may be, I don't consider that the end of the world, because I wasn't drinking that water, and no one in New York City was drinking the water. They were drinking much better water than they have now, because precisely because of a modern industrial civilization. You have large quantities of low-cost iron and steel pipe, chemical purification plants, the ability to bring the water from other areas. You know, this whole idea that pollution is some problem of industrialization, well, where I live, it's a 75-mile drive to a third world country, Mexico. And if you want to sample the water, just ask yourself the question, where would you rather drink the water? In an advanced industrial country or a third world country? And why? In the third world country, you take a big risk of typhoid or cholera or whatever else may be going around. In an industrial country, precisely because we have chemistry and engineering and industry, the water is clean. We have vastly more clean water precisely because of industrialization. And it doesn't mean that each and every river or lake has to be clean, but the overwhelming outcome is much cleaner water and in many respects much cleaner air. Just imagine what it was like to live in a large city before the automobile. New York City was already fairly large in 1900, and every day they used to have to shovel tons of horse manure off the streets. And horse urine, which attracted all kinds of insects and flies and was very unhealthy, and you couldn't avoid stepping in it and getting sloshed with it. And not much before that, like in early 19th century London, and everywhere in the world before some point in the 19th century, the open streets and the sewers were one and the same things. And that's the way it is in many parts of Calcutta and other third world cities. And the idea that pollution is a problem of industrialization, that's a diametric reversal of the facts. Yes, Ms.
Well, note on pollution and environmentalists, they have created a new market for the capitalist entrepreneur to come in and to establish specific companies that can come in and clean water, can check your air, and establishing products that are green products and that type of thing.
Okay. Well, all right, now you're implying that that's some sort of benefit. Yes. Okay, but I think what's implicit in your idea is that there is some need for work, that what we need is work to do, things to occupy us. The truth is, we don't need work to do, we need wealth. And the only means of creating more wealth is by making our labor more productive. Now, the idea of having to produce things to solve problems that we don't need to solve, I mean, that's like boondoggle projects. You know, having people build pipe and then disassemble the pipe. That's from the labor unions. The construction unions for many years had a practice. Pipe would be delivered to construction sites with a screw thread already cut on the end of it, and they would think that's their precious province. They'd cut off the end that had the screw thread so that their men could put it on. Well, the economic problem is not the making of work or the opportunities to produce. The economic problem is how do we succeed in producing. And this sort of activity, useless activity, undercuts our ability to produce. And if you look at the cost of environmental regulations, I think they've added trillions of dollars to the cost of production. This is a major reason why half the population is still no better off than it was 15 or 20 years ago. This is a major reason why so many families need two breadwinners to earn the same that one used to be able to earn. Why things cost much more than they need to, why people earn less than they otherwise could. You see, these things have a huge cost, and they're not paid out of business profits. Business profits are a relatively small part of the economy, and they would have been exhausted 100 times over years ago if all the interventionist measures came out of them. They come at the expense of wages and prices. And this is a major instance.